Hey, Lila. Hey, Lucy. Good morning. Good to see you. Ryan, Jeffrey, good morning. So good to see you. Stephanie, great to see you. Thank you for being here. We are going to get started in just a minute. Folks are entering in from the universe right now. Christine, good to have you. And I am really looking forward to this discussion today and have a couple of updates for folks in the community, as well as our allies who are tuning in. Good to see you, Lila. Thank you for being here.
Hi.
Thank you all so much for being here. I'm just going to go ahead and get started with some thoughts to set the stage for this conversation. I know folks are coming into the room, so that'll buy us a few more minutes of time for our esteemed guest speakers. But I would be remiss not to mention that this has been an especially difficult and hard week in our country, on top of a couple of very difficult years. So I really appreciate you being with us here today for this teach-in and summit. And as you noticed, as you came in, this is being recorded to share with members of our community and allies who couldn't be here today, as well as reporters in our network and some of our congressional targets as well. The event is being organized by Marked by COVID. For folks who don't know, Marked by COVID is the grassroots nonprofit leading the national movement for pandemic justice and remembrance. And we are founded by and for those most harmed by this disaster. We promote health, equity, accountability, and a pandemic-free future. For those who don't know me, my name is Kristen Urquiza, and I lost my father, Mark, to COVID on June 30th, 2020. For our agenda, I will spend a few minutes setting the stage and showing some of the work that we've done to date to advance the call for a nonpartisan effort to investigate and take account for our government's response to the pandemic. I will then turn the conversation over to our guest speakers today. We're very grateful and lucky to have both Lila Nordstrom and Stephanie Kaplan with us to pull from their experience in the aftermath of 9/11 and more recently to help us sort of imagine what's possible and what's needed. Lila was a high school student near the Twin Towers when the 9/11 attack happened. Afterwards, she spent the last 20 years advocating for healthcare and services for the full range of survivors and victims from that disaster. She is the founder of Stye Health and also an author. And Stephanie Kaplan is an alumna from the 9/11 Commission and now works as the chief of staff to the COVID Commission Planning Group, a body that has been doing the groundwork to launch a COVID commission at the drop of a hat, or more accurately, at the passage of legislation. On that note, we have been advocating for legislation for a commission or a task force for a little over 2 years, or a year and a half actually, since December of 2020. We recently, yesterday, sent a letter to Senator Schumer's office, the majority leader in the Senate, asking him to prioritize bringing the Prevent Pandemics Act to the floor prior to the summer recess in August, or the August recess. August may feel like a ways off, However, it's under 40 working days for the Senate. So it's imperative that we ramp up pressure to ensure that this legislation gets a proper vote. The before August recess deadline is also incredibly important too, because as we head into the fall, as you all know, it is a 2022, an election year, and it will be increasingly difficult for lawmakers to really prioritize this type of legislation. We thought that this teach-in would be appropriate in the weekend or the leading up to the weekend of Memorial Day, because this is all about accountability, but it's also about the truth and remembrance. This Sunday, I'm going to be attending a service at the cemetery here in San Francisco in the Presidio to pay respects to soldiers who have lost their lives in battle. But I'm also going to inspire, imagine, and dream, because I want to live in a world where we have permission to mourn people who died not only in battle, but who died in disasters, and in particular, preventable tragedies, like the 1 million people that we know we have lost to COVID, as well as the children we lost this week in Texas and their teachers. And why do we have to remember? If we don't, nothing will change. Our communities will become sicker. Years of our life will be shaved off from people that we love the most, from people in this room. Children will live in a perpetual state of fear. These are all policy decisions, and we're the people in charge. The most powerful weapon that I've ever wielded is not a gun, but the weapon of my own authentic story, my emotions, and my call for a better tomorrow for all of us. This is simply why we share our stories, why we call for truth and accountability, to make it impossible for the people in charge, for our elected officials, to look away. Impossible to stay and see to demand action, change, and justice. I appreciate you all being with us today, for taking this hour to take a step back and learn from our past, so that we can ensure tomorrow is a better day for all of us, that our loved ones, that we have answers to why this happened, how in the richest country in the world did this happen, and also so that we can hold ourselves accountable, so that we can change policy, so that we can ensure that we pass on a better government to future generations. So without further ado, I just want to share a little bit more with Marked by COVID and the work that we have done to advance the call for a commission task force. And also, I know Christine just shared with folks a link to the letter that we sent out to Senator Schumer's office. The reason why, for folks who don't know, we sent this to Leader Schumer is because he's in charge of setting the calendar for what can be discussed on the floor. So he has the power right now to be able to set the agenda to get a vote for this bill that would currently establish a task force to look into the government's response. It would also do a whole set of other things in ensuring that we have adequate PPE and other prevention measures. But for folks who may not know, I'm sharing my screen with you all, and I'm just zeroing in on some of the work that we've done through Marked by COVID over the course of the last year and a half to build pressure for a commission. We have spoke about this on live television, in news articles, and with elected officials, both at a leadership level, but also an individual level. So I personally have been out there calling for a commission, but Marked by COVID has also done a number of these types of teach-ins and trainings in order to support members of our community and our allies in building up their knowledge base, as well on not only the commission vehicle itself, but also just how to engage members of Congress on these issues. We've generated thousands of letters into congressional offices calling for a commission. We've held over 200 meetings, both in person when it's been safe to do so, and also online in Zoom, with members of Congress and their staff, calling for a commission, sharing our stories, and making it clear that we need answers to our response and actions. And we're delighted to support and be on record for supporting the PREVENT Act, which passed in Congress on March 15th of this year. But as you can all sort of look at the calendar with me, March 15th has now been over 2 months, and we need this to continue to move through Congress if we are going to have a chance of getting this commission to come to fruition. So we are excited to be here with you today. I am going to basically take a moment to go back to my introduction of a couple of our guests. We're going to start with Lila, who I mentioned at the top of this call is an advocate and survivor from 9/11. She has been a leader in the 9/11 survivor movement in ensuring that we think about the entire range of individuals who are impacted by that disaster and ensuring they have access to healthcare, benefits, services. As the co-founder of STI Health, she's worked really closely with alumna at her school and also is an author. And I'm hopeful she'll share with us a little bit about her book as well. So without further ado, I'm so delighted to invite Lila to come and share with us her experience as sort of a peer from 20 years ago, and how the role of commission, the 9/11 Commission specifically, played for her work and areas, some of the learnings that she's had to share with us. Lila, on behalf of the folks in the room, as well as people who will see this, thank you so much for your generosity in being here.
No problem. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm always, as I think I've told you guys privately, I'm always looking for a way to sort of pay forward the experience that I have had over the last 20 years, because I think there's a lot of parallels between what the COVID advocacy community is going to experience and what I've been through. And I feel like it's important for advocates to share those kinds of experiences with each other. So, as you've just heard, I'm the founder of STI Health, which is an organization that works with 9/11 survivors. And I would point out just at the beginning of this, so that there's not confusion, we use the term survivor in the 9/11 community to refer to kind of civilian survivors as opposed to responders. So there are two groups of people that the Zadroga Act, which is the main piece of federal legislation that we worked on, address. And one is first responders. I'm sure you've heard a lot about them in media. And then the other is the 400,000 person survivor community, which is the regular people who also had their health impacted by the events. So when I use the word survivor, I'm generally, if I don't clarify, referring to that community, just so that that's clear. But so over the last 20 years, I've had a lot of experience working on building federal legislation to address the needs of 9/11 survivors. I've learned a lot about the process and where maybe some gaps often appear. I have been on the, the federal advisory committee that advises the program that we ended up establishing in the Zadroga Act. And I have testified before Congress. I was the person you did not see in the media coverage of Jon Stewart's blockbuster remarks in 2019, but I was the only person from the survivor community to testify at that hearing. We were frequently vastly underrepresented in advocacy efforts and in media. And so I think I also learned a lot about what it is to be from the community that's not at the forefront of a conversation about, disaster response. And so before I go on, my book is called Some Kids Left Behind, and it is available on the internet, but I will hopefully tell you more about that later. I just thought I would throw that in because I know Kristen mentioned it. At the moment, this is an incredibly important conversation to me for a lot of reasons. Obviously, I'm also someone who's currently experiencing some long COVID related issues. So it's become incredibly important to me of late. And I think in terms of how the 9/11 Commission has impacted my work, from the outset, I want to say it's really understandable why we use this comparison when we talk about the COVID crisis, because we really don't have a lot of corollaries for large scale disasters like this and how we think about, or how we discuss them, how we create sort of like a national narrative around them, how we remember them, what we do to ensure that we properly account for them. And when I first started StyHealth, one of my first emails was to one of the members of the 9/11 Commission, who was coincidentally an alumni at my school and was a great source of support in our early efforts. And I think in the case of COVID, though, we have an opportunity to really think about something much bigger and more inclusive than what the 9/11 Commission was to us at the time, because the 9/11 Commission's mandate was fairly narrow based, compared to what we know now about the impacts of the attacks. So, it was really about the policy failings that led to our sort of inadequate response, the sort of foreign policy failings that led to our inability to predict an attack of that scale would happen in the first place. It was established fairly quickly. And so at the time that the 9/11 Commission was put together, we didn't really know yet that there would be this sort of other lingering piece of the conversation, and that 20 years later, and on the 20-year anniversary, what we would be talking about would be the health consequences of 9/11, not necessarily the foreign policy failings of 9/11. So I think the valuable comparison here is really about assessing and improving our preparedness, because the 9/11 Commission report did a really good job of doing that. It was an opportunity to look at why something on the scale of 9/11 was able to happen in the first place. And in the case of COVID, we're going to have, we have a lot of those same questions we're going to need to answer. And we also want to make sure that just, from a preparedness standpoint, that we don't let this happen at the next pandemic's outset. And then the other thing that was really critical about the 9/11 Commission to our health advocacy work was that it established a narrative that the government had been unprepared to respond to an event of that magnitude. And later on, when that lack of preparedness had other consequences and resulted in the federal government choosing to send people back into Lower Manhattan before it was safe, exposing us to, a large range of toxic chemicals in the air and in the, on the surfaces around us, we had this sort of definitive proof that they had not been fully prepared, that was a piece of the 9/11 story already, and that had been established by a sort of nonpartisan commission that was looking at these attacks. But even at that moment, 9/11 was being experienced really differently inside of New York City than it was outside. I think there's often a sense that 9/11 was an attack that happened to all of us because it was like this world, perspective changing event to everyone in America. And it was the scale of the crisis and just the way that it changed our understanding of what it was going to be to live in the present and in the future was massive. But if that same federal government that was looking for answers about, why this attack was allowed to happen in the first place had been also engaged in the conversations that were happening on the ground in New York City at that time, they would have been able to see that 9/11 was ultimately going to morph into a health catastrophe. The issue was already a major local crisis at the time. And I think the sort of main thing I would impart that we have an opportunity to do in the case of the COVID crisis, and we did not get to do when it came to the 9/11 Commission, was ensure that we don't make that same mistake. So the this establishing this sort of like story of why 9/11 was able to happen and in what ways the federal government was not prepared to respond to it was an incredibly critical part of of our ability to make the argument later that they had also not been prepared to respond to the sort of like human scale crisis that, you know, that continued in the aftermath of the attacks. But I do feel like, we have an opportunity now to, you know, make sure that impacted communities are not sort of overlooked in the report that we hopefully get about what, you know, how the COVID crisis has impacted communities. And also, you know, Kristen mentioned preventable tragedies. And I think the distinction I would say on 9/11 is the 9/11 Commission covered the piece of the crisis that could have been preventable with, you know, different sort of like large scale preparations, but it did not contain the piece of it that was preventable in the moment. So in the moment, it would have been preventable to, you know, it was preventable that people like me were going to get exposed to, you know, the toxic air after 9/11. I did not have to get sent back to school on October 9th, 3 blocks from the World Trade Center in the middle of the cleanup. They did not have to put the barge they were bringing the World Trade Center debris to right next to my school. There were choices that were active choices that were made in the aftermath of the attacks that were not just large scale preventable, like from a preparedness standpoint, but were preventable in the sense that like they did not have to happen even in the moment, that someone like me who was not caught in the dust cloud didn't ever have to get sick from 9/11. So I think the areas that I sort of think we have an opportunity to really like analyze now and would be hugely impactful and are why, you know, a commission that looks at how this crisis happened to us, but also like what we want to do with that information has an opportunity to address is, you know, the COVID equivalent of the 9/11 cleanup. Did our response to the events help or harm, and in what ways? You know, in New York, I'd say, you know, were emergency services prepared to handle the scale of attack? Not really. But what did that mean to regular people going forward? And because of that, who did the response help or harm? What are likely to be the ongoing harms? And, you know, how should we address those harms, or who should we look to for leadership on that front going forward? I think, you know, there's an opportunity in taking a full scale analysis of the COVID crisis and how it happened to sort of establish who we want to look to for leadership as we, you know, as we sort of figure out what the ongoing costs of the COVID crisis are going to be on communities. And then I think in this case, also building resilient practices so that, you know, future pandemics don't cause this scale of crisis is a critical part of any, you know, or a critical opportunity that we would be missing if we didn't have any sort of commission to analyze what happened here. Because in our case, you know, it wasn't just about foreign policy, it was about decisions that were made by our own government. It was about who we decided to sacrifice and not sacrifice in the aftermath of the attacks. And it felt like we didn't really use the lesson of 9/11 to establish those practices in emergency response on the scale that we could have. We didn't build future practices that, you know, that head off the sort of concern, or that we didn't build future practices that allow, you know, us to make better decisions in the midst of the chaos of an ongoing crisis in the way that we could have. And we don't want to let that happen in the case of the COVID crisis. And we don't need to let that happen. So I think the sort of main thing that we should be thinking about is how we want to devise the mandate for a COVID commission to be as inclusive as possible, to include as many sort of like community voices as possible, or to at least include the analysis of as many impacted communities as possible. And I think that one of the exciting things about this effort is that this is really an opportunity to do something like the 9/11 Commission, and to do it on a different scale, and to do it in a way where the impacts, you know, have a wider range of possibilities. You know, I think that's really, like, to me, the most critical piece of this conversation, and why I'm so eager to be involved in it, because I see that the 9/11 Commission built like an important national narrative around 9/11 that we had to use in order to do health advocacy work that and that we used effectively to do health advocacy work. There are not a lot of disaster communities that do have federal health programs. There are not a lot of disaster communities that even got what the 9/11 community got. And that is sort of shameful when you think about it. But I think we also want to make sure that, you know, in the case of community members who are not at the forefront of the conversation around 9/11, around COVID, not because they aren't the most impacted, but because they aren't the most visible, that, you know, we use an opportunity like a commission to ensure that they have their needs addressed, that their future needs are considered, that we make accommodation for the fact that like the needs of communities that are impacted by COVID will evolve, and they may evolve in ways that we don't expect. You know, I don't know that anyone expected at the outset of the 9/11 Commission's establishment that 20 years later, the conversation would be about healthcare. And that, you know, that the 20th anniversary would be about the people who had died since 9/11. I don't think that that was something that anyone would have predicted at the time. And I think that we have an opportunity to not let that happen in this case. So I think it's incredibly important that we take an accounting of, and an even broader accounting of what's happened here and what we can do about it. In case, I think that's it for me.
Lila, thank you so much for that. And it's so reminiscent of our very first conversation that I remember having with you over the phone in, you know, late July, early August of last year. And I remember walking away from that conversation feeling like not so alone. And I absolutely agree. And what I mean by that is that there are natural alliances between survivors of different disasters. And, you know, with you, I feel a kinship as we view the world so similarly, but as well as power to ensure that we are learning from the past and creating a better future for us all. So thank you again so much for being here and all of your work and sharing with this community today.
Thank you guys for your work. You do really important work, and I'm very excited to have you guys on this effort and on this team. So
great. We are now going to change gears and invite up our next guest speaker to share with us. Stephanie Kaplan is just a force of nature herself. She is an alumna from the 9/11 Commission, and she's also been working with a group of individuals that have come together to really lay out the groundwork based upon their learnings from 9/11 to enable any commission that were to come up to be ready to go at a moment's notice. She'll be able to explain a little bit more about different commission vehicles and sort of the work that it takes. But as I'm sure that you all can imagine, to be able to have a commission take on this effort, there will be a lot of work that needs to be done. So the groundwork that the COVID Commission Planning Group has done and is doing is just such an essential resource that we have to hopefully one day put into place. So Stephanie, the floor is yours to share with us your experience and learnings. And thank you so much again for agreeing to be with us here today.
Of course. Thank you for having me. You know, and hi, Lila, I've never met you before, but I just wanted to also thank you for everything you've done. I wanted to start by picking up on what Kristen started out saying, which is that this has been a really heavy week, you know, and I couldn't help but think about all of the gun safety activists that have worked for so many years to enact change, particularly the Sandy Hook survivors and advocates, because, you know, when that happened, I think a lot of people thought, okay, we're going to do something. Something's going to change, right? We can't tolerate this ever again. And 10 years later, we're confronted with a similar event. And when I thought about those advocates, I thought, my God, did they ever think they'd be doing this for 10 years? you know, and comparing them to you, you know, I think that what you've gone through has been so massive and so traumatic. I'm sure you're thinking 2 years later, did I think I'd be advocating for commission for 2 years? How long are we going to have to wait? How long are we going to have to fight for this? Now, the group I'm representing today, we're not a lobbying organization, but I can put myself in your shoes and understand that, you know, it's already been a long fight for you. And so going into Memorial Day weekend, I was thinking, obviously we want to remember what Memorial Day weekend is for. And Kristen, you're just amazing to be doing that. But I also want to remind all of you on a 3-day weekend to take some time for yourself, that this is a marathon, not a sprint. And, you know, do something for yourself that you might not do normally. Book a doctor's appointment, buy some new nail polish, you know, do something for yourself this weekend that will help you stay in this fight as long as you can, right? Because you don't know how long you'll be advocating for the change that you want to see. So I'll be going, I haven't been to a movie theater in over 2 years, and I really love movies. So I found an outdoor drive-in that's still open and is playing current movies. So there's no pandemic could stop me from seeing John Hamm in a uniform. So I'm going to be going to see Top Gun 2, like an hour north of me. So please find something that makes you smile and take care of yourself. So as I said before, I'm here to represent the COVID Commission Planning Group. Our director, Philip Zellico, wishes he could be here, but he's traveling. Philip Zellico was the executive director of the 9/11 Commission, and I worked directly for him and for our deputy, Chris Kojum, as a special assistant and as managing editor of the final report. And so I had a bird's eye view of the 9/11 Commission and the process and different components it took to put together what is generally reviewed as a successful commission. And I can't take credit for that, but I got to see a lot, you know, everything go down. And so fast forwarding to today, both Philip and I and many others have wanted to kind of take that recipes for success and try to build on that to hopefully lay the groundwork for a COVID commission. So we are not a commission, and in no way do we assume that if there's legislation passed that we will be the commission. It's not a plug and play situation. The people who make decisions, we're not the people who make decisions, but we've been working for the past year and a half to create a blueprint for what that investigation might look like. And we've said whether we're involved or not, we would hand over that blueprint to whomever is doing it, because a commission is very hard to pull off. It's essentially a startup, right? You know, the legislation gets passed and the next day you're supposed to have an office and phone lines and people and emails and websites and everything, and you're supposed to get everything done, you know, in a very short amount of time, and it's very high profile. So it's a big ask for any topic, but researching COVID and figuring out the COVID story would probably be one of the biggest investigations in US history. So with that in mind, we've been working with the generous support of several foundations to lay that foundation. We spent very much the early part just talking to people and listening from all walks of life, experts and people like Kristen who and you who have had these experiences, and really just taking all that in and trying to put all the pieces in an order that makes sense. Because one of the things that I like to say is that 9/11 Commission is a little bit more like the 9/11 story was a little bit more like a crime story. like a true crime story, right? There were criminals, although, terrorists, and they had a plot and they succeeded in that plot, right? And the people, we talk about who tried to thwart them and couldn't. But COVID is more like a war story. It's taking place over many different battlefields, on many different fronts, with many different people. And the story, in order to tell that story in a comprehensive way, first of all, a COVID commission, if it does happen, will just be one of many, many voices, because we'll be telling this story forever, for the rest of our lives, right? Just like we're still telling stories about World War II or World War I that have just been unearthed, right? But, we do believe that a COVID commission will be a very heavy lift. And so we've been organizing for the past year and a half to just figure out how that investigation might proceed. So it has been a while. And so, I guess I'm here to say, why don't we have a COVID commission yet? There are a couple different ways you can do a commission. One is you can have a commission that's started by the government, either by Congress or the executive branch. 9/11 Commission was created by an act of Congress and signed into law by the president. There are also presidential commissions that the president can appoint, and all of these have their pros and cons. There are certain aspects of it that make them easier to work with than others, but it's also possible to have an independent private commission. And so Philip Zelikow was also the director of the Ford Carter Commission that worked on election reform. So going into this, we were always open-minded about what form that commission might take. But so far it hasn't taken any form. And we went into this year thinking that maybe the independent commission was the only option. But at the end of January, like Kristen mentioned, Senators Murray and Burr, who head up the HELP committee, dropped a bill that established a 9/11 style task force. So it's not called a commission, but it's very similar. And they invited comments. And I know we submitted some feedback. I think Kristen and your group did as well. And then the bill came out, or actually, well, the guidelines came out and they voted on the new bill in the committee on March 15th. It voted out of the committee 20-2. And I actually listened to the whole hearing and it was wonderful. It was very productive. And it was great to see, such unity on such an important topic. But of course, it still has to get through the Senate, back to the House, and then back to the Senate. So it's got a ways to go. And again, I don't represent the HELP committee or anyone in Congress by any means, but Kristen was accurately described that one of the ways this bill could pass is by going to the floor and having a straight up vote. Another way is that it could be attached to something else that is kind of a must pass. You've probably seen this in the past with, defense bills that fund our military. So that's how, by the way, the Afghanistan Commission was passed back in December, I believe. And I'm not sure if they've announced the commissioners yet, but it's just getting underway. So that's where we are. I think, again, I don't represent anyone on the Hill. So, we've heard that, it might be, they might be making an effort to go straight to the floor. But of course, every other topic that comes up in our daily lives might take up some of that floor time too, right? So, a couple of weeks ago, it was, pro-choice legislation, and now we might be talking about some gun legislation, or gun safety legislation. So Kristen's right that the calendar is important. And, from our perspective, not only is it important because of the pandemic still going on, but we want to make sure that people remember what happened, right? We've talked to a lot of people. We do have kind of a lot of initial impressions from folks, but getting a commission started as soon as possible will not only help us prevent the future pandemic, but it might even help us in the current one. It's not only a moral issue, but it's it's an economic issue too. And it's important on a lot of different levels. So so we obviously hope to see some action on it before the August recess. Maybe there's a chance that it will be brought up somehow in the fall. But either way, we're standing ready to support whoever becomes the leadership of that commission and give it the best chance it can to prevent this from happening again. So that's all I have to add this morning. And I just want to thank you, Kristen and Ryan and Christine and all. I see some familiar faces here from the last time I chatted. So I just really want to thank you for your work. And again, encourage you to do something kind for yourself this weekend so that you can continue to advocate in the future. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for your remarks and everything that you've been doing to keep your eye on the bigger picture, but also I know your commitment to our families and ensuring that our voices have a seat at the table in this work. And I put in the chat, in addition to Memorial Day activities, I get to go pick flowers at a farm with my favorite almost 4-year-old this weekend. So
that's perfect.
Yes, I'm really looking forward to it. We have time for a couple of questions, but before I open up the floor to questions, I want everyone to take a moment to write down this phone number. And so get a pen and paper ready. If you're on a computer, you can copy, paste it into a notepad or an email. It is 202-224-6542. And that we're going to pretend like we're in a bathroom stall and it says call this number. But this is actually going to be call this number for Chuck Schumer's office. And I have a very simple script that I just put into the chat, which I urge you to copy and paste. And I would like for everybody before Monday to call this phone number, leave a message. If somebody answers, you can also just say this directly to the individual on the other line of the phone. And it's simple. I'm calling to urge Leader Schumer to bring S3799. So again, that's 3799, the Prevent Pandemic Acts, to the floor for debate and a vote before August recess. The reason why we're having this kind of call to action is because while there will always be things that get in the way, we are a thing. We are a powerful voice. We've been looking at some of the numbers of just like, how big is this community? Not necessarily just the marked by COVID section of the community, but people living with long COVID, people who have lost loved ones. And just this week, the CDC's own research, the Center for Disease Control's own research is saying that 20% of people who had COVID at one point or another have long COVID. We know from the little bit of research that has been done about the bereaved, people who've lost loved ones, that there are at least 9 individuals who are in severe mourning due to a loss of a loved one from COVID. Together, that is at least 31 million people in this country. 31 million people in this country who have been severely harmed by this pandemic that we know of. 31 million people. If we were a state, we would be the second largest state in the union between California and Texas. We have a powerful voice, and we are going to use that voice to ensure that our legislators take action. What that means for an individual, just one of us in these little boxes, is something as simple as taking the next step, picking up the phone and making this phone call. The great news is you can leave a message even. If you want to call right now after this and chat with somebody, you can do that too. It matters. It matters. And I cannot express enough how much it matters, because not only for making action happen, but it's this collective action that raises the profile of these issues, that shows our legislators that we are 31 million people strong. So I will get off my perch and open up for questions. And I see that we've got Monica with her hand raised. We'll go to you, Monica.
Thank you so much. First of all, my apologies for coming late. I actually slept. That's something I've been doing, is not ever setting the alarm clock. So I actually slept into late this morning. So I missed the opening setup where you're discussing plans thus far. And I was wondering if I could ask Stephanie to talk to us more about what the key arguments are for a commission and investigation, because let me introduce myself. I'm a historian of medicine, and I've been working, I spent all my career as a historian of medicine, but I switched to infectious diseases about a decade and a half ago. So I'm one of the people that saw all this coming. And I'm one of the people that, on the sidelines was, the Cassandra saying, don't let this happen, don't let this spread. You don't know how big this could get, how long we'll be living with it. And so what I also know is that there are so many people who don't want to remember, who don't want to recognize what's going on right now. And a big factor is the playbook was wrong all along. The playbook was taking an understanding about medicine, public health, and their capacities from a century ago and saying, this is how we should conduct pandemic control now. So let me just give an example of that. In the 1918 flu pandemic, they had no tests to test for if someone was infectious. It was basically, you just had to get to the whole range of somebody on their deathbed before you'd say, okay, this person likely has this disease that seems to be going around. So that what that means is there was never any possibility of an intervention earlier. There was never the possibility of isolation, of quarantine, and so forth. Another thing to keep in mind, they didn't understand what the pathogen was. There was no mechanism for any kind of virus to actually study the virus in a laboratory. We had a full genomic sequence of SARS-CoV-2 by January 5th of 2020. So we've had all of these capabilities all along, but they weren't implemented because people were thinking, oh, well, we just have to take it on the chin. We just have to suffer it. We just have to build up, universal immunity. So anyway, my point is simply the narrative of even how the commission is set up matters. The narrative itself, if the narrative is including these kinds of waivers, of diminishing assessment. So my point is part of the commission needs to say what was possible in terms of a response. And if people say nothing was possible, we did all we could, that kills it. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. That's a great question. Some interesting points. Of course, on our team, two of the people on our team, well, one of them is John Barry, who wrote the book on the 1918 pandemic, and Carter Mesher, who might disagree with some of your points, because he found in working on the pandemic preparedness plan under the Bush administration that there was some cities did implement NPIs and did prevent sickness more than others. And so there was some variation in some outcomes, and he tried to take those lessons and apply them to a pandemic plan in the early 2000s. But beyond that, why should there be a commission? It's a great question. I think, Philip always says that in order to have, when you have a patient, you have to diagnose the patient before you can come up with a treatment plan. And we've all lived through this for the past 2 years. I mean, obviously, Monica saw this coming given her background, but we've all been living through this. And so we all think we know what happened, but we really don't know everything that happened. Even if, we have aspects that are right, there has not been a thorough investigation to preserve and record the history of what happened. This, like I said before, the scale of this pandemic is so massive that it would be foolish to assume that we know everything. And so the first step of a commission is just to record the history without, with an objective viewpoint, and make sure that we know what happened so that we can come up with policy prescriptions to prevent it in the future. And so, your point, Monica, about not having the technology back then that we have today is a powerful one, because that is absolutely correct. With all of the know-how and all the advancements that we've made in 100 years, we weren't able to bring those to bear to save the lives that we needed to save. And the question is why? What impediments were there? Were there institutional impediments? Were there individual impediments? And so, we have to look beyond individual personalities too, whether it be of President Trump or other figures, because there are, as we can see, these institutions carry on across administrations, and dysfunctions can continue on regardless of who's running them. And so we really have to go into it with a very open mind about what happened. And that includes the origins of COVID, which some people are very passionate about and have their assumptions, all the way into, what we could have done to mitigate the pandemic once it entered our shores. So I don't know if that totally answers your question, but wanted to make sure I gave you a good answer.
So I have something to say. I think
Jesse, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I'm just noticing that we only have 5 minutes left, and I know we have a hard stop. So I'm going to actually recommend a couple of things. One is that if you still have questions that you would like to be answered, if you could send them to our Marked by COVID email address, we can work on getting answers and include those in the wrap up email that we send out with the recording of this. So I'm hoping Lila and Stephanie might be able to answer those, and that we can do that in an efficient way so that we can make sure that we get folks' questions answered. Second, this has been absolutely an incredibly important conversation. It's not the last conversation, and we will definitely be back with hopefully Lila, Stephanie, and others to continue to update folks on where we are in this process and give you opportunities to engage both in the here and now, as well as the historical precedents that we have. And then final thing that I want to make sure that we center ourselves on before we go about and leave this space and get consumed by everything else that's around us. This will not happen if we do not continue to raise our voices to Congress. So I am going to just once again put into the chat, this is your call to action right now. This is the thing to do to channel yourself into, to make that phone call today or this weekend to Senator Schumer's office to ensure that we can put onto this timeline over the course of June, hundreds of calls, over the course of late May, early June, hundreds of calls into Senator Schumer's office to demand that this be addressed because it's essential. And building off of what Monica had just said, and Ryan and Stephanie, this is all about so much, but first and foremost, it's working to ensure that we do not forget. We must not forget, but inertia, precedents, and the fear of what we will find and the fear of accountability are powerful forces that are there, persistent and not going away. But we have the power, we have the opportunity to continue to come together, to continue to raise our voices, and to continue to contact lawmakers to ask them to do their job. So again, I want to thank everybody for your attention and participation on this really, really challenging week. If your question wasn't answered, please spend a moment to send that to our info account, and we will provide additional quick answers in the wrap-up note that will come out either this weekend or early next week. So on that note, please, I hope you all go and make your phone calls. And I see that Krista is about to do that. And thank you again to both Lila and Stephanie for being here today and sharing with us your experiences in this space. I hope you all have a moment this weekend for yourself and for your loved ones and your family. And I look forward to continuing this conversation to ensure that this work progresses. Thanks, everyone.